Templeton will be my co-host. Lon and I are both members of the MAE Board of Directors. Just a little technical housekeeping before we start. Please keep yourself muted. If you have any questions, please pose them in the chat, and questions will be addressed during designated question breaks. Our presenters today are Nancy McCrohan and Nathalie Winans. Nancy and Nathalie are senior staff members of Public Policy Associates and have conducted scores of program evaluations. They are both longtime members of MAE, and Nancy is a former member of the MAE board. She is also the recipient of the MAE Annual Service Award. In today's session, entitled The Astounding Power of Fidelity to Strengthen Evaluation and Interpretation, Nancy and Nathalie will discuss the arc of fidelity from designing a fidelity assessment to interpreting fidelity results. Once I switch to Nancy and Nathalie's slides, they will get started. Okay, Nathalie, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Miles, and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's really a pleasure to share with you today the astounding power of fidelity to strengthen evaluation and interpretation. That is a very deliberate choice of words. I tend to be a little more moderate in my wording, and I tried to push back on that, but Nancy was like, nope, fidelity is astounding, and you know what, she's right. So we're gonna make that case for you today. Today's agenda, we're going to talk about the value of fidelity assessment, so the facets and the importance of fidelity. We're going to help impart an understanding of how to select measures of fidelity, so design issues in focus and in metric selection. We're going to give some information about how to overcome challenges to measuring fidelity and how to use what you learn to make improvements, so how to extract useful lessons. And finally, we were going to hopefully help you appreciate the value of fidelity for the interpretation of outcomes. So I'd like to move on to talking about what exactly fidelity is. If you could move on to the next slide.
Sorry, Nathalie, I'm having a little bit of trouble here getting the slides to advance.
Okay.
I'm not sure why. Let's try this. Here we go.
Here we go. Okay. So what the heck is fidelity? So there is not a hard and fast agreement in the field about an exact definition of fidelity or fidelity of implementation, but there is a general consensus. So generally speaking, fidelity data are only about implementation of programs. These are not outcome data. Hang on, sorry. Could you move to the previous slide? Sorry. Still on the slide number 3.
Yeah, it's really not cooperating with me. I think I'm going to try a different approach to sharing slides to see if that works better.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I keep losing the slide advancement controls. They keep disappearing from the screen. Working on it. Sorry, folks.
Yikes, technology.
Yeah,
technology. It's just, it's wonderful when it actually works correctly.
Yeah. Well, I'll just foreshadow to the group what we'd like to do today is provide just a lot of information about what we know about Fidelity and some of our experiences in, say, the first half of the hour. And then we're going to save some time in the second half for questions and breakouts and discussion. So hopefully we can bring in some of your experiences as well to kind of liven up the discussion and keep it interesting, and compare notes. Because as we were putting this together, you know, I have some distinct experiences, and I'm very curious about what other evaluators have experienced in trying to do these sorts of assessments. So this is, I'm planning on this being pretty good fun for me. And no matter what we see on the screen, we can always share our slides with you later if we need to.
Right. So hopefully we will continue to be able to see the screen, but if we can't, we'll just try to make our verbal delivery as clear as possible so that you can follow along.
Is this the slide you want, Natalie?
Yes, it is. Thank you. So again, Fidelity data are only about implementation. These are not outcome data. That's the big distinction here. It's about how a program is implemented and what it looks like in reality compared with what a program is conceived to be in theory. So fidelity of implementation is the extent to which an enacted program is consistent with the intended program model, how it's operationalized.
Next slide.
Yes, please. So what are the facets of fidelity? What are the components of it? So fidelity is currently described in the literature in terms of a small suite of elements that need to be measured. And those are adherence to an intervention. So whether the components of an intervention are being delivered as they were planned and designed. The next one is exposure or dose, which is the intensity and the duration, or the number, the length, or frequency of components, of parts of an intervention that are implemented. The quality of delivery, the manner in which the implementer delivers the program using the techniques, processes, or methods that were prescribed in the program design. Participant responsiveness. So participant responsiveness is the extent to which participants are engaged by and involved in the activities and the content of the program as planned. And finally, what is it that differentiates the program? What are the unique features or the unique features of program components or programs as a whole that set them apart from other interventions so that they can be reliably assessed against those other interventions? So next slide. So I wanted to talk about moderating factors or mitigating factors. So the relationship between program elements can be really complex, and so intervention complexity is an important factor to consider in fidelity. So and I also wanted to mention another aspect of another way to look at fidelity, which is process and structure. So structure is adherence to or duration of a program, and the other element is process. So that's quality of delivery or program differentiation. And so these are other ways that fidelity can be looked at in the literature. And I just wanted to briefly mention those just because it's another way that people sometimes look at fidelity. Next slide. Okay, so why is fidelity important? Why does it matter? Why is it astounding? So the research literature has found it to be absolutely clear that verification of program integrity is an essential element of program evaluation. And yet, fidelity is not often undertaken, and that's why we're kind of doing a Fidelity 101 presentation here with you today. Fidelity is undertaken too infrequently, and it's underreported and underemphasized in the research literature. So there's a real opportunity to increase the role of fidelity in your program evaluation. Next slide. So these are just some more notes about the value of fidelity assessment. A lot of dimensions and a lot of ways that fidelity can help you conduct your evaluation. And even though fidelity data are strictly about implementation and not program results, fidelity results can greatly aid in interpreting your program impacts. More specifically, when an evaluation ensures sound measurement of fidelity, it allows for results that are defensible, testable, and scalable. And the value of this cannot be overstated in terms of the applicability and the usability of evaluation. I mean, you want your evaluation to be actionable, right? And yet, fidelity is not necessarily of intense or frequent interest to the client. So sometimes you have to make the case for it. And next slide. So this is a poll. We want to get your opinions from y'all who are here with us today. How would you describe the extent of your experience in assessing program fidelity? And there should be a poll that will come up on your screen.
We're getting responses.
Getting responses, great.
16 of 20 have voted. 17, and that's probably all of the participants. Okay, I'm going to close the polling and share the results. Can you see them?
Yes.
Okay, so a lot of variability, and looks like there's a need for more education about fidelity, so that's why we're here today.
All right. Next slide.
Okay, and now we're going to move it on to Nancy with some conversation about a little more depth in how to do fidelity assessment.
Thank you, Natalie. So we're going to move along swiftly so we can have some time for discussion. These are the steps in assessing fidelity from my perspective. So we're going to talk about each of these. And just as an introduction, only really after establishing core program elements can we then identify indicators that are responsive to those core elements and craft specific measures to capture the extent and the nature of adherence. Once we do that, we're on to collecting, analyzing, and interpreting the data. And next slide, please. As referenced, the assessment begins with defining the core elements. These elements are a short suite of features that are deemed uniquely characteristic. So when you talk about the program, this is what makes it the program. Without these, you don't have a unique differentiated program. Now this sounds, I think, simple. It seems like it's a step that could be done without the evaluation team, right? Presumably already done by the program developers. But in our experience, these really must be refined and explicated iteratively between the client and the evaluation team. In other words, we want to make sure those core elements are accurately defined so that they can be operationalized as indicators with thresholds. And of course, you want to use the existing logic model as a point of departure or foundation. And I say breaking it because I usually break the logic models because I don't find them to my liking. So next slide, please. So that is my experience, but this is one of my curiosities. Please answer this poll. How often in your own experience are program elements identified in close collaboration between the practitioner and the evaluator?
Okay, just a moment while I get the next poll up here.
Sure. So when you come on board a project, sometimes you see a logic model already developed. Sometimes you see a program model with no theory of change. Or sometimes you might find a logic model or theory of change that you just don't like me. So there's your poll.
Okay, that looks like everyone has responded, so I'm going to close the polling in just a second here. And you should be able to see the results now.
Okay, so it's a little mixed bag. We've got most of the time and sometimes making up the majority of experience, and some people not sure, and that's fair because not everybody has a ton of experience in this. Okay, very good. So it might be a little bit me, it might be a little bit fussy. So I'm going to move on. Miles, if you would, I'm going to spend a minute talking about the indicators. There are many issues that could hinder the development of criteria for fidelity, or those indicators. Some of them revolve around complexity. So, for example, there might be interventions that have a distinct clinical facet that really depend on practitioner decision-making or clinical expertise. Sometimes there's programming that is so tailored to make sure they meet multiple needs of individuals. That's why, and wraparound can be very difficult because it may not come with a clearly articulated theory of change. And sometimes you even see issues that you may not foresee, such as a lack of consensus on operational definitions of key components, such as what is a team, that sort of thing. So one thing you can do if you foresee a project that might be extremely complex, you could do an evaluability assessment first, which would reveal if the intervention mechanisms for change are perhaps poorly defined, or perhaps unrealistic in their objectives. Another way you could break down the complexity is to look at what are the intended results per target audience, and then trying to identify what are the impacts on them as an interim measure. So what I'm trying to get at is sometimes you're focusing on the traditional participant, but there may be also facets where you're looking at the environment or systems change, or even the implementers perhaps maybe are supposed to gain skills along the way. So things to think about. Next slide, please. So these are some common foci for a fidelity assessment. So here we're organizing them by structure and process. Dosage is usually part of structure, but it was nice to bring that out. And one of the things I'd like to ask you guys, thinking about your experience, is there a particularly common focus in your fidelity assessments? And if you want to use the chat box, please, you're welcome to just add a few words in the chat box about your most common focus in doing fidelity assessments. And while you do that, I'm going to move on to the next slide. Now, the research tools, they could be your own tools when you get to this point of making tools, but you may also use existing validated tools. That is sometimes very appropriate when you have, say, case management work or work that overlaps substance abuse or behavioral issues. And a lot of the work that you might be doing is going to be qualitative, but I invite you to put also in the chat box, if you'd like, any measurement tools that you think have been particularly successful. So the names of those tools, if you could put those in the chat box while I move on, that would be very helpful. We'll take a look at those. If you've got any you would like to share. Now, I want to talk about measurement challenges in the next slide. If the core elements are unclear or you cannot get a grasp on the right indicators to operationalize those, then your methods will certainly suffer. So that's definitely a challenging area, perhaps more for me than for you, based on the poll. Now, I have had one experience where there was an implicit core element, did not show up in proposals, did not show up in memos or protocols or training documents. But the weirdest, oddest thing was that almost every stakeholder brought it up at our first really big site visit. So we knew that we had missed something and weren't sure why we had missed it. But this is great to have a workshop like this, because then I can tell you all my faux pas, right? Again, when you're getting to the thresholds of adherence, it's really important to make sure you have identified your justification for those thresholds. And again, this is something, typically these are also overlapping with the client's performance metrics. So I have had clients, suggest thresholds that were based on pilots, which was good, we've had them suggest business as usual, or a threshold that was below business as usual. I've actually had a client say this was out of thin air. So you want to, help think about those and provide some justification, hopefully from the literature or past experience, that sort of thing, rather than, of course, thin air. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, a lot of the Fidelity data will be qualitative, and that means the methods can be resource intensive. So you might have a challenge in the form of whether you have the right level of resources to apply to averting, say, potential biases, or making sure you have a sufficient depth of data to make sure you understand the nuances of the program, to illuminate the fidelity and how the results have come to pass. So, an example of resource intensity is, I had a project where all of the facilitators were required to attend an in-service. So if we were interested in attendance, then that is really a checkbox that almost anybody could have generated that data for us. But if we wanted to measure, say, engagement or learning or leadership in those, then we probably would have wanted to attend the in-service instead. So really making those distinctions up front is helpful to balance out what you need to know and what your resources are at hand. So next slide. So interpreting fidelity, this is fun. I gotta say, the reason we really wanted to do this presentation was because the fidelity results I've seen have really varied from strong to not strong. And Natalie and I recently wrapped up a project where the fidelity was really phenomenal, and it kind of inspired us to think about why. At any rate, project evolution, usually you may have, say, a project may be developed a little more in a startup phase or a design phase, and it may look a little different than, say, the funder proposal for that project. And that's fine if it evolves, but once you get to the actual implementation stage, you might want to say, this is it. These are our boundaries for how much you want to shift adherence. I actually had a client who said, we are going to redefine participants after we got started after a few months. They wanted to make a distinction between enrolled and genuinely served. And that was fine for them, but we stuck to enrolled as the evaluation analysis. Post hoc, have you ever had to modify a specific definition of fidelity to fit the available data? This could happen, say, if you had an indicator such as 90% of relevant staff will attend training. Well, do you have a good definition for relevant? So was it the division? Was it a job title? Is it that every agency has a different job title for every person? Or perhaps that the database you were relying on to tell you that really didn't tell you that? Just foreshadowing, that sort of thing happens. And sometimes you might find that the project missed the mark, but you have some reason to think that they actually performed well, even though they missed the benchmark. And that happened to us once when we were looking at the average number of contacts between a case manager and people who were job searching. And it turned out this was a lengthy intervention with multiple phases. And it was really inappropriate in that final phase for people to really have a high number of contacts. So we really had to adjust for what phase they were in. So while they maybe didn't quite meet that benchmark, maybe they did a good job after all in doing the appropriate thing. So I'm going to move on to our final poll. And I want to hear about your experience. And what we're asking you for here is you can pick multiples. You can pick up to 2 responses in what you think were the most challenging facets of assessing fidelity. 1 or 2, don't pick more. If you're not sure, then you're certainly welcome to say not sure.
Nancy, do you want to pause for questions after this poll?
I'm taking a look at I think no, we'll move on because we're actually almost at the breakout.
Okay.
And while voting, I see Sam.
All right, I think we're done with the voting here.
Aha. So the top 2 vote getters are clarification of program elements and creating or finding measurement tools. And specifying the indicators was also pretty high up there. Okay, well that's really helpful. So we're going to make a note of that. So we're actually going to, I'm going to turn this over to, actually no, I'm going to tell you one more thing and then I'm going to turn it over to Nathalie. But we're going to talk about each of those 5 things.
Next slide.
Next slide, please. Thank you.
Yep. So the next couple of slides are actually pretty germane to the responses you just gave in this poll. So I wanted to talk briefly about what is it that makes a project high in fidelity? What does a project like this possess that projects that are low in fidelity do not have? And generally speaking, what high fidelity projects have is structure and specificity. So structure in terms of curricula, training, clear instructions, clear standards, ongoing supports. So specificity is great, right? On the other hand, that said, a program can be too detailed, too specific. There is some evidence in the literature that it's easier to achieve high fidelity of implementation in projects or in interventions that are simple rather than ones that are more complex. So that's another thing to keep in mind. You want to have specificity, but maybe not too much specificity. Next slide. Okay, so what are some other factors in high fidelity? So these are kind of process elements, and the project that Nancy alluded to that she and I recently finished, one of the things that we observed is that this project was really high in fidelity because it had really strong communication across team members and also across partner agencies. So people were constantly talking to each other, everybody was on the same page. A big factor in that was project management. So this project had very strong leadership, very engaged leadership, and a key staff person who was engaged in every aspect and facet of the project. And that in turn required strong buy-in at multiple levels. So what we saw was strong buy-in and knowledge of the program from the executive and management staff all the way down to frontline staff. So all these factors come together to make a project smoothly implemented and therefore high in fidelity. So with the next thing we'd like to do, if you can move to the next slide, we would like to move out into a breakout session. And we're going to share with you a Google Doc where you can add your recommendations on how you would improve the ability to identify the best indicators and thresholds. How would you improve the ability to interpret Fidelity results? What are optimal measurement tools? And what are optimal data collection methods? So this relates pretty closely to your answers in the poll a few minutes ago.
Okay, so in order for us to do this, I have to stop the share and post the link to the shared Google Doc in the chat. And I'm going to do that in just a second here. Okay, the link should be in the chat. And we're going to send you into breakout rooms in just a minute here. But before you leave for your breakout room, please click on the link that I just shared and open the Google Doc so that you have it. Once you're in the breakout room, please designate a note taker. And the note taker will be responsible for briefly recording key points of your discussion in the Google Doc. You will see the document contains a set of questions for you to choose from, the ones that Nathalie just read, organized by breakout group number. Please briefly summarize the key points of your discussion in the section for your breakout group. Okay? And I am going to send folks into the breakout rooms now. So let's make 5 participants per room for 3 breakout rooms. You shall see an invitation to join a breakout room in just a second. Does anybody have a question before we send you to the breakout rooms? If you do, please unmute yourself. Okay. All right. You'll see an invitation to join a room in just a second.
Is really as important as the use of reliable and valid measures and sound design and sampling. Well, let's look at some of the comments. So group 1, I see you've been talking about knowing your audience and pilot testing. That's a really great idea. Willingness to adapt language. Thank you. That's a very good idea. Group 2, I love that you're bringing up adaptation. That's really great. Sam, I would love to have a conversation with you. I was just talking about a project we recently wrapped up that was a very high fidelity, was at scale. It was technically a pilot program, but it was a multi-year pilot program, and it was implemented in 10 sites across Oregon, with 14 facilitators and over 1,200 participants. And we actually found there was a great deal of consistency in participant results, which we attributed to strong fidelity. Group 3, I love this, really taking a deep partnership and mentoring approach with the folks you're evaluating. Absolutely. Work backwards to see how the program components are being implemented. Process. Okay. We'll see if they're moving away from program theory. Oh, that's a really good point. We certainly have seen that. Does anyone from the breakout rooms, do you want to explicate or talk a little bit more about your notes in your group? And thank you, note takers.
Yes, thank you. Please, if you want to comment on the questions, or you have other questions for Nancy or Nathalie, please unmute yourself. No? Nancy or Nathalie, any final thoughts?
I would say one of the things that really comes out strongly in the Fidelity literature is discussions about adaptation, and it's been just a great discussion from back in the 70s from some of my predecessors in my graduate program, and I think I'm very interested in this EPIS framework to think about that. It's true, their adaptation will happen. And it's the fun part and the intrigue of Fidelity is to figure out, does it matter? Is it negative? Is it positive, right? So sometimes those adaptations are basically points against you, but sometimes they're very positive and help move the program forward. I was just chatting with Miles during the breakout and saying, when in human services, when you work with human service agencies, I think you should just let them do their thing in recruitment. They know what they're doing. They've done it a lot. Within the constraints that you may have for an IRB or something, just let them do that. And I think that is something I've decided I don't care about too much in Fidelity assessments. Maybe a program will come along that will change my mind, but so far it does not seem to matter too much. Yeah, so I think my only other comment is, wish us luck in our article, because we're gonna try to publish the results from this to where we actually used Fidelity as a moderating variable to explain some program outcome results. So that is one of the ways you can use Fidelity outcomes to help interpret your program results. So anybody else, any last thoughts? You are welcome to do so. We've got a few minutes if you want to chat or unmute yourself. If you've been talking, you're muted.
And please don't run away early, because I've got a few more things to share with you, as well as an evaluation survey for this session.
So any questions, any further content that you'd like to share?
Yes, I have a question. So what's the software that you would recommend? I mean, Fidelity is not just a result, but it's a process, and also it informs the practice. We do not want to at the end and tell them the result of Fidelity. But we like to inform people in the process, and it looks like it's connected with data tracking. So we have the system in place. So not only we know the Fidelity at the end, but during the process, we know if anything is off track. So what software or process or management skill tools that you guys would recommend? Thank you.
I invite everyone else on the call to feel free to answer that. I don't have a platform, but that is absolutely correct that you want to track that. We found that sharing the results along the way has been very helpful in helping kind of course correct. It's part of the quality improvement along the way in a project. Other thoughts about tracking on that or sharing that?
So I'm trying to think of something specific. I feel like it's hard to come up with a hard and fast answer, because it's going to depend on the characteristics of the program. But the range of tools and techniques that we've seen can include everything from site visits to interviews to surveys to document reviews. It just depends on the characteristics of the individual program that you're tracking.
Right. Sometimes when it's like quantitative, you're able to send those out pretty quickly. Sometimes when it's more qualitative, we've done like quarterly briefs where we share our findings, our observations to date, and then that gets disseminated through whoever needs to know that, so they can use that to monitor their own implementation.
Any more questions for Nancy or Natalie? Let's thank Nancy and Natalie. And before you leave, for an excellent presentation, and before you leave, I'd like to share a little more information with you about what's coming up next. So we have some additional sessions coming up. After this, Culture First, Practical Tools for Creating a Culture of Learning and Inclusion on August 12th. Leveraging Qualitative and Mixed Methods, Data Design for Cultural Responsive Storytelling on August 20th. An online tool for data management and analysis on August 26th. And then on September 30th, removing barriers for participating in community-based evaluations by putting people first. As I've mentioned a couple of times, we have a session evaluation form for you to complete. I put the link in the chat, so you could click on that and complete that right as you leave. We will also email that to you if that's more convenient. We're going to follow up by emailing the Google Doc to you as well. We thank you for attending. It was good to see all of you, and we hope to see you at our upcoming sessions.